Good evening. Turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. In New York City, a man that was an art collector went to go to some stores to see what he could find. And he came across a cat eating out of a saucer. And as he looked at the saucer, he noticed that the saucer was very expensive. But he didn't want to tip the store owner off to that fact for fear that he would have to pay a great deal for the saucer. And so he walked in and he looked around for a few minutes. He said, I saw a cat out there eating out of a saucer. And the man that owned the store said, yes, that's correct. And he said, tell you what, I'll give you $20 for that cat. And the guy said, that sounds like a good deal. I said, I'm fine with that. And so they began to make arrangements. And he said, the collector then looked at the man selling him the cat. And he said, how about throwing that saucer in? If he's used to that saucer, how about throwing that saucer in and for the $20? And the man looked at him and said, nope, can't sell you that. That's my lucky saucer. And the collector said, it is? He said, yeah. He said, I've sold 25 cats just this week eating out of that saucer. So, be careful what you buy, folks. Hey, listen. I have one for you, Jay, but, that's one of the better ones. You like that? Yeah. No, I did not. Oh man. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. I heard one this morning on chapter 11. I don't know, somebody may have taken chapter 11, so we won't tell it. But chapter 11 is a great chapter in the book of Hebrews. The Hebrew writer has been spending time. He gave us the definition of faith in the first couple of verses. And then he began to talk about by faith individuals that did certain things. By faith, Noah. By faith, Enoch. By faith, so forth and so on. He talked about certain individuals. And now all of a sudden in verse 13, 14, 15, and 16, he sort of takes a little pause, a little break. A little pause in what he's been talking about. And he talks about something else. He's still talking about faith, but he goes at it a little different angle. And he says these, talking about, I believe, all those that he's mentioned thus far in this chapter, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were assured of them, embraced them, confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. We've been talking about, as we kind of looked at each section of faith and the ones that the Hebrew writer has mentioned, we've said, these by faith, what did they do? And so kind of, if you were trying to dissect this whole chapter, you might ask yourself, for this section, do we have enough faith with regards to what God says to live for the treasures of heaven? Look how he looks at this. He says these, and we said evidently that's probably those that he's been talking about in this chapter. These individuals, they all died in faith because, you see, they had not received the promises yet. Faith becomes sight, and it is no longer faith, right? And so he says that they were living in faith. They hadn't received the promises. They lived a life. Now, that's something that we don't, when we're going through this chapter and reading it, we don't stop to think about. And sometimes we don't think about it when we read the Bible. And that is that all these folks existed. All these folks are real. This is not, if you will, this is not a play or a novel. The Bible, that is not a play or a novel where we just sit back and we're just reading characters in a story that's made up. We're reading actual facts. These died, but they died in faith, because up to that point, they had not received the promises. But notice what he says. They'd seen them far off. Their faith had caused them to see it. Their faith had caused them to say, oh yeah, I know what's waiting for me. We all live in faith. Faith becomes sight after this world, right? And so the Hebrew writer says they saw their promises, but they saw them afar off. And they were assured of those promises. They embraced those promises, and they admitted to the fact, we're just here temporarily. We're strangers and pilgrims. We're just sojourners. We're just passing through. They understood that. That is an understanding that men, and I'm not talking about Christians, but men all over the world, people all over the world, need to learn. This is not the payday. This is the efforts, if you will, in order to get to the payday. That's what we're living this life for, or should be living this life for. As a society, we've missed the mark of seeing that this life is preparation for what is to come. And so the Hebrew writer says, these folks understood it. They embraced it. They saw it, and they confessed, hey, we're just passing through. And so, verse 14 says, those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. The word homeland there, the Greek literally means a native country. Here's what we would call it: home. When you think of home, what do you think of? Anybody, what do you think of? When you think of home, or when home is mentioned, what do you think of? Safety, comfort, work. Yeah, there's a whole lot of it around the house, isn't there? Cooking, yeah. Family, love. All of them true. Home is that word that when you mention it, it does bring up different ideas, because we think of home, we think of what we have now. But also, when we were younger, we thought of home as being what? Where mom and daddy were, right? In college kids talk about going home. They don't talk about being at home in college, but they talk about going home on the weekend, or we're going home in 2 weeks, we're going home in 3 weeks. You know, we talk to Ethan about once a week. We try to make it more often, but that's all he can stomach. But we talk about, when are you going to come see us? When are you going to come home? And reality is, this is not home for him. But home is that safe place, the native country. These folks sought home. And so, as they sought home, verse 15 says, clearly, they had called to mind to that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. They're looking for a country. And they would have an opportunity to return, but they desire a better land. They don't desire the physical land. Back to the physical land, but the Hebrew writer says, no. They desire better. They had a pilgrim's outlook. We think of pilgrims, we think of what? Plymouth Rock, Thanksgiving, turkeys, right? That's what we think of. But a pilgrim is just a traveler, a sojourner, one that's passing through. And so he says that they're folks with a pilgrim outlook. They're folks that are just travelers. They desire better. And what is better? Well, better is heaven. Therefore, God's not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. All of a sudden, that last sentence seems a little strange. It does not carry the thought of the paragraph there. It summarizes it, yes, but it doesn't really carry the thought of what is in that paragraph. It's not a strange verse in what it says. But notice and think about what he says. He says, these folks desire better. They want heaven. And because they're seeking, look at the word therefore. Therefore is a bridge word. We've talked about bridge words before. Therefore is a bridge word. It connects what is in front of it with what's behind it. And so as it connects, it's saying therefore. Well, what is the therefore? He's explaining now. These people that were seeking this heavenly country, God is not ashamed to call them His people. He's not ashamed to be called their God because they're seekers. They're doing their best. They were seeking heavenly country. And so God is glad to be called their God. He's not ashamed of them. He loves them because these folks are looking for that city. And notice what he says right there at the last part of that sentence. He has prepared a city for them. So He's making it ready. Anything along those verses that you want to think about or talk about? So the question then becomes, do you trust God enough to live for the treasures that He talks about? Do you trust God enough? Think about it. We, as Christians, have put, and I think justly so, don't get me wrong, but we have put a tremendous amount of faith in this Bible. We put a tremendous amount of faith that there's a God, that He exists, and that this is His Word, His revelation of Himself to us. Now, I think we can prove all that. I think we can prove that there's a higher being, mankind. I think we can prove that there is a supreme intelligence, designer that designed all this. There is a want then for Him to reveal Himself to mankind. And then as we go to the Bible, we say, okay, this is His revelation because He says it is. Now, can we prove that this Bible is a product that is above and beyond human capabilities to produce? And the answer is yes. And so then all of a sudden, our faith becomes real, right? We understand where we're coming from and where we're headed based upon the facts of the Bible, the truth of the Bible. And so we place faith in God, and we place faith in His revealed will. So then the question comes, are we willing to seek Him and to put all of this behind us and realize that all of this is secondary and He's first? So that's the thought there. That's the thought. Anything else? Well, now the Hebrew writer kind of gets back on task, at least for this chapter. He talks about the patriarchal age. You know, there's the patriarchal, there's the Mosaical, and there's the Christian. And he talks about the patriarchal age, and he'll talk about the Mosaical age here in just a few minutes. But let's talk about the patriarchal age. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, of whom it is said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Let's look at Abraham for just a minute. Abraham was tested. Would you say that was a true statement? Yeah. Abraham was put to the test. Let's think about the test of Abraham for a minute before we kind of get back to the text. The test of Abraham. Abraham was promised what? Through your a nation, through your seed, all the nations of the earth be blessed, a nation. Yeah. So there's his promise. Abraham, though, has a problem. And what's his problem? No children. And he's old. He tries. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Way too old. Yeah, way too old. I understand that. That's right. He tries to intervene in God's plan, right? He and Sarah, they come up with the idea of bringing in who? Hagar. Sarah's what? Handmaid or maid. Ishmael is born. That's not what God wanted. And so God still says, it's going to work out. And so it does. And he has a son by the name of what? Isaac, who was Sarah's son. So this is the way God had intended it. This is the way it works out. God comes to Abraham and says, you're going to offer up your son. It's a sacrifice. Have you ever put yourself in Abraham's shoes? You ever thought, what would you be feeling at that point in time? Great sorrow. Very true. What else? Fear, most definitely. Yes. Great confusion. Yes. Bewildered. God, you promised me, and now all of a sudden you're going to take it away, get the grief, the other issues at hand. And what are you doing? And why are you doing it? So, yes. Anything else?
I mean, because he told Isaac when he asked, where was the sacrifice? God will prepare for him.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So he never stayed there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As well as all the else. I mean, there was the uncertainty and fear and everything, but I think there was some things.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Or he wouldn't have done what he did.
Brother S.P. Lowry did. Some of us. But anyway, I was in one of his classes, and he was talking about that, and he said, we envision when we see Abraham and Isaac going to that place, that Abraham has been over in sorrow and pain. And he said, Abraham knew that whatever it was, that if he was allowed to sacrifice him, then that he would come back. But he said Abraham never doubted that God would take care of the situation, and all of us sinners are just wrong worried about it.
Which is absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. The Hebrew writer here in verse 19, though, gives us something that we don't see in Genesis, the book of Genesis, where the story is told. And that is that Abraham had a thought that God would raise him up. That if I offer him, God will raise him up. I have no reason to doubt or even debate the Hebrew writer, but it is something you might say, well, where's that in Genesis? You're not going to find it, or at least I haven't. Let me back up. I hadn't found it. You might can find it. I haven't found it. There is great faith, without doubt, that Abraham is willing to get up and to go ahead. In verse 8, it says, God says, in Isaac your seed shall be called. You see, that was God's plan. God's plan was that the descendants, here's where they would come from. But we need to know certain things. We need to know, look at verse 17 where it says, and he who had received the promises, offered up his only begotten son. The tense that's used here is that he received the promises and offered. He was in the act of offering, not actually offered. In other words, he didn't kill his son. And when we read that and we look at it kind of closely with regards to tense and verbs and such so forth, it seems as if to say that he offered his only begotten son. Well, no, he was in the act of offering his son when, according to the book of Genesis, God stopped his hand. And of course, God said, "Don't do it." God, as I said, God provided the ram, just as Abraham had told Isaac that he would. And so, this is concluding that God was able to raise him up from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. And so, the Hebrew writer says, Abraham felt like God will raise him. God will somehow work this out. God will take care of it. And beyond that, when you see what he says that he received him up in a figurative sense. Well, he did, because he raised him up off the altar, right? And they then sacrificed upon the altar that they were going to offer Isaac on. And they offered a sacrifice to God. And so by faith, Abraham moved. By faith, Abraham did what God wanted to do. He moved in the way that God told him to move. By faith, go ahead.
Paul, before this,
Mm-hmm.
Abraham included that seed come from. Now that's the question that I don't see where it tells us, because he was living where they worship idols and offer sacrifices in that community.
Yeah.
So he grew up in idol worship.
Yes.
And somehow God talked to him and he needed to leave so he could teach him.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have a chance there to
Right.
teach him anything unless he got him away to another country.
Yeah.
So Abraham had faith to leave his father, everything there. There was a lot of faith in that part.
Absolutely.
I mean, how he gets to offer his son, he and God's had several conversations. And he's been proven, God's word has been proven to him over and over.
Yes.
So this ultimate act followed much conversations and happenings.
That's right.
But that first time, why did God look down and he could see the personality of Abraham, and he knew what he would do, and he said, "I need you to go." Okay, I'll go. But to me, why would he have the faith there?
That's right. That's right. What got his attention to begin with? And I don't know. Like you said, scriptures don't tell us. But that's an interesting aspect within all of our lives. It would wake the normal guy up, wouldn't it? It really would. Yeah. I knew somebody asked that. The word here is the word monogenes, same word used in John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The word itself is used a few other times in pages of the New Testament, and it's translated with the idea of uniqueness. And literally, the word itself, monogenes, from a literal standpoint, mono meaning one, genes goes back to a word genao, which means to begot or to begot or give life to. The word, though, monogenes, is probably more correctly translated unique, one of a kind. Now, does it work? Well, let's just use the two verses that we are very familiar with. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that he gave his unique Son. I'm trying to think when it was. Late 1980s. Yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood. There was a tremendous upheaval within our brotherhood over the fact that Brother Hugo McCord, I don't know if you all are very familiar with Brother Hugo McCord. Brother Hugo McCord was a scholar, a great, wonderful, wonderful, godly man who used me as information to write a couple of articles. He was a prolific writer. He was an educator. He taught at Oklahoma Christian. Brother McCord, there was a couple of us, and I can tell you who the other two were, but Lance Cordell and Mike Johnson wouldn't mind me mentioning their names, and Dan Winkler kind of got in on it. We sometimes got stumped in graduate school, and so Brother McCord was who we called on. So I have a couple of articles that he would say, some young men were traveling to graduate school and came up with this question. Oh, yes, that's us. Where Brother McCord in the 80s, in the 1880s, yeah, in the 1980s, translated the New Testament out of Greek into a very, very readable New Testament. Freed-Hardeman University has the rights to the translation itself, and they still publish it. Brother McCord translated in John 3:16 that God gave his unique son, and some in our brotherhood that thought that was just heresy. First of all, when you say Jesus is unique, you're not denying his deity. Matter of fact, in many ways, to me, you're elevating him as unique. Unique is the idea of one of a kind. There's nothing else like it. Now, fast forward to the fact that he, the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 11 says, with regards to Isaac, he is his unique son. Unique in what standpoint? Through him, all the nations will be blessed. The promise. There's another sense of the uniqueness. We covered it a while ago. Only? Okay. That's not what I'm thinking about. That's good answer. It's not what I'm thinking about. He was old. She was old. In fact, doesn't it say in Genesis 12 that she was past her prime or past her time? Past childbearing years is what it says, doesn't it? Is it Genesis 12? But anyway, it makes that statement with regards to Sarah, if I'm not mistaken. And so, therefore, you have a word that is translated only begotten and could mean only begotten, only born. But then you have a problem contextually, don't you? What's the problem? He had more than one child. Now, just to throw you off track, let me give you Brother Hugo McCord's answer with regards to John 3:16. In John 3:16, where it says that Jesus is God's unique son, the reason that Brother McCord preferred that as opposed to only begotten is because why? God has a whole lot of children. We are his children. But Jesus was special. He was unique. Born of a virgin. So there's part of his uniqueness. Born as part of the Godhead, and thus still the Godhead, even when upon the face of the earth. And so Brother McCord's answer, I guess, is probably the best way of saying it. Brother McCord's answer is that monogenes, which means unique. You go back and look at a lot of the Greek dictionaries for the word, it can mean unique. And so that's the best. But Isaac was probably unique. Brother Neil Lightfoot, in his commentary, Jesus Christ, same yesterday, today, forever, has a good little discussion on that if you're interested, on why this is also unique in Hebrews 11. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah.
Isaac lets his father bind his hand and lay him on the altar.
Right.
I don't know if I, this,
Yep.
it's a great parallel, and I think
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that the writer uses that term, because here was a son willing to die.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah, because I think we get the picture that he was a little bitty. He was not. Yeah. So you're right.
Very likely he was in his 20s when this.
Anywhere from, I've read as young as 12, but I've read, on it because, that's considered the Jewish manhood time. But yeah, good. And probably in his 20s.
We talk about Abraham being past. He had other children after this.
Yes, that's the point.
We teach our kids to sing the song about Abraham.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. All good. Well, yeah, the lifespan went way down after the flood. That kind of gets you back to that canopy theory we talked about last week with regards to the flood. Yeah, we had Methuselah live 969 years, and nobody's reached that since. Thank goodness. Anything else? All good. I don't know. I probably better stay out of that one, Billy.
When Moses died and he was 120, they said his natural forces were not abated nor his eyes dim.
Right.
So God wants you to stay, He will help you to stay with Him.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Sure. Anything else? Well, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. If you have a version that does not read staff, that reads bed, there are some versions that have that. And it goes back to the account in the book of Genesis 47. And I don't have a way of showing you, but everything's a consonant. A few hundred years later, they put markings under them, under the consonants. And sometimes it would be one, what we would just look like a period to us, up under the consonant. Sometimes it was two, and sometimes it was a triangle, and sometimes it was a upside down plus, or T really. And those are the vowels. It's called pointed Hebrew. And that's when you're taking Bible classes in college and they want to teach you something, they teach you how to decipher all that, so to speak. And it's very complicated. Greek's not near as complicated as Hebrew. But basically, the difference between staff here, as the New King James reads in verse 21, and bed is what would amount to one period, one consonant. So you can see over a period of time how parchments got changed, things, got skewed a little bit. And so, which is it? Don't know. I'll go with Rod or staff, because I think that's probably more correct. But there's just a little variation there in the Hebrew text in Genesis 47. And so different versions read differently. Let me read this last one. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones, which he did. They didn't bury him where? They didn't bury him in Egypt, but they buried him where? Okay, there's your research question. They buried him in his homeland. There's the answer. But look at all of these, verses 20, 21, 22. By faith, they all served their families. By faith, Isaac blessed his sons. By faith, Jacob blessed each of his sons. By faith, Joseph mentioned to his children. By faith, these folks were doing something for their family. How do we translate our faith to our family? And there's plenty of examples of where we haven't done a real good job of that, and there's plenty of good examples of where we have done a real good job of that. And I don't think there's just one answer. And if there were, or if there was, then there wouldn't be 11,000 books on them. There's not. I don't know how many there are, but there's a lot of books on how to translate your faith, how to raise your kids where they'll follow the Lord. And it comes up to a two-way street, in my opinion, and that is train them in the way they should go, Proverbs 22:6, but also understand that they have free will. And they still, based upon their attitudes, their actions, and what they've seen, they have to make up their own mind. And so then the question that would be asked of me is, do you think Proverbs 22:6 is a correct statement? I think that it is a statement made by God, but it's not an absolute statement. If it's an absolute statement, guess what it does not allow for? The possibility of apostasy. Right? Train child in the way he should go, when he's old, he should not depart from it. If that's an absolute statement, then guess what? You can't fall from the grace of God. But the Bible teaches you can. So what's the answer to Proverbs 22:6? Well, the answer to Proverbs 22:6 is you lead them the best way you know how. The old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I think that's a fact by virtue. And so I think that Proverbs 22:6 basically says, train your children in the way they should go. And then, of course, ultimately they have to make that decision when they get out on their own. Suzanne used to when we were young, when we had first gotten married, and when decisions had to come about, am I going to stay with this work or am I going to go to another work? And then we'd be trying out, and is this work acceptable? My father was an elder at the church and had been for years, and my sweet wife would say, your daddy, and talk to your daddy. And I said, I can tell you what my daddy's going to say. And she said, what? She loved my daddy. My daddy loved her better than he loved me. But she'd get aggravated at me for saying it. But I said, my daddy will say, it's your decision. You have to make it. You have to live your life. Thanks, Dad. But we have a responsibility as parents, right? Teach our children. Show them the way. Teach them when you sit down, when you rise up, when you walk, according to Deuteronomy 6. And so we have a responsibility. By faith, we need to serve our families. And by faith, these men did. Anything else? Yeah. That is very true. That's a great point. That is a great point. If you think about the Bible, this to me is the beauty of the Bible. Is that the Bible shows men and instructs us how to be perfect, complete, but uses flawed men to show those principles. Think about it. Abraham was not sinless. Moses, who led the children of Israel, as we'll talk about next week, was not sinless. But what were they? If they weren't sinless, they were striving, right? And that's what we all are. And that, to me, is part of the beauty of the Bible. If I was going to write a Bible, if you will, if I was going to write a Bible, I'd use perfect men, perfect illustrations to try to get my point across. But the Bible doesn't. It uses flawed men to get its point across. But what does that help us understand? When we screw up, God got them through. He'll get us through. So isn't it wonderful? God blessed us with a great revelation. Thank y'all. Hope you have a great week. We'll have our prayer.